Crypto isn't just about the commercial part. It's about the ideological part. It's about the fact that the banks have failed. It's about the fact the political system has failed. It's about the fact that we need an exit. It's about the fact that we need self-sovereignty. And the missing part of that is privacy.
All right. Hello, everybody, to another episode of Accelerate with Mert. Today, I have with me the man himself, Balaji, with a nice haircut as well. Balaji, how you doing?
Well, I got in honor of you, Mert. Both bald bulls of a certain indeterminate Mediterranean complexion. A large swath that extends from roughly Spain, I don't know, several thousand kilometers out east. So good to see you.
Likewise. So the way I want to frame this conversation is to first introduce the listener to how you think about the world, and then how the things that I'm interested in, crypto, ZK, privacy, etc., play into it. But very quick, I want to start with two interesting facts that you probably are not familiar with that were relatively important for me in my development. One is that I joined Twitter in 2020 or maybe 2021. And you were actually, when I had about 8 followers, you were the first person to ever DM me, where I tweeted about 1729, if you remember, the bounty platform that you had. And that actually was one of the things that convinced me that I need to do more stuff on Twitter, because I was like, people actually pay attention regardless of the amount of followers you have, if you say,
something
what I thought to be interesting stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one. And then number two is, you might remember this, but me, you, and Naval were talking at some point in the past few years, and I told you guys that I still was in Canada, and how I didn't like that. And then you guys basically put the fear of God into me about how Canada was going downhill, and was actually the main reason why I came to Dubai. So thank you for that.
Well, I hope it seems I hopefully. In my own small way, helped upgrade your standard of living, both digitally and physically. Right, you built a Twitter following, which would be helpful. And yes, I think you had a good tweet the other day where you said something along, and it was actually a well-structured tweet because you anticipated the objection. You're like, I don't care. I'm just paraphrasing. I remember, but it's like, I don't care if you move to Dubai or not, but I would have loved to have heard something like this years ago, because I had gotten psyoped into thinking that Dubai actually sucks and, blah, 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 right? And essentially, unfortunately, Canada sucks in many ways, right, nowadays. Unfortunately, I take no pleasure in saying that, but it's just not what it was. It's on the way down, and Dubai's on the way up, and, Riyadh's on the way up, and the East broadly is on the way up. And people are just finally starting, maybe gradually, to cope on this, and then what comes next we'll see. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's I think a good place to start framing or painting the picture here. I was actually recently, and we can take this part out, sure. The specific part. I was actually in Montana with there's a Founders Fund event, and it was all Teal and Palmer and everybody, and we were kind of talking about like this East versus West thing, and they were obviously very West-centric. And then in my back of my head, I'm like, reading Balaji's stuff, I'm not sure if I believe most of the stuff. Like, and I actually live in the Middle East now, and this is maybe where we can start from. Why don't you maybe introduce people briefly to your frame of East versus West and state versus internet, for people who are not familiar with the concept, and then we can weave in how crypto plays into that.
Sure. Okay. To radically oversimplify, if you take Dalio, he's saying the post-war order, the West, is going down and China's going up. If you take the sovereign individual, it says the post-war order is going down and the internet is going up. If you take Dalio plus the sovereign individual, it says the post-war order is going down and the future is China plus the internet, or China versus the internet. And that leads to network state, where it's not just the sovereign individual, where you have the network above and this cloud above, but the network takes physical form. As an analogy that happened in history, when Rome fell, Christianity persisted. And the reboot was on the base of Christianity. And in fact, actually, it's a deep analogy because arguably Christianity, and people always argue this, arguably Christianity helped tear down the Roman Empire, But then the synthesis of Christianity and the Roman Empire created the Holy Roman Empire. Now, people will say it wasn't in the same place, and it was in Germany, and it was north of, where Rome was, and it was neither Holy nor Roman Empire. Okay, fine. But thesis, antithesis, synthesis, the thing that tore down the empire helped rebuild the next version of it, right? And the West is arguably being, and people will argue this, being destabilized by the internet. Because in a sense, social media is like ultra democracy and cryptocurrency is like ultra capitalism. Another way you could put it is social media is like glasnost and cryptocurrency is like perestroika, which were the forces that, Gorbachev had these reforms that took down the Soviet Union at the end. He allowed more free speech, which was glasnost. He allowed more capitalism, which is perestroika. And that basically broke the Soviet Union apart because it couldn't withstand the forces that unleashed. And so if you take the view that actually we're in the middle of a giant mark-to-market on the West, where all of the G7 is simultaneously in the throes of sovereign debt crisis, with their yields going up like this, which is kind of like their credit rating. So it's like, the interest rate on your credit card is going all the way up because people are becoming a worse credit risk. And people instead, rather than buying US bonds, are buying Chinese bonds. Chinese yields are down to the floor. They're buying gold, which is through the ceiling. And they're also buying digital gold and cryptocurrencies, right? So they're exiting US bonds, which are the bedrock of the Western financial establishment, the 10-year treasury, for Chinese bonds, for gold, and for digital gold. This is what Dalio talks about with the changing ruler. That's the financial component. The military component is that, now we've seen it, and this, I think my worldview has been validated with essentially the announcement of everlasting peace is really American surrender on Taiwan. We won't know exactly what was said in that meeting for a while, perhaps, but when JFK negotiated with Khrushchev over the Cuban Missile Crisis, it wasn't just that the Soviets pulled missiles back from Cuba. It was that Americans, Incirlik, you're Turkish, so an Incirlik base in Turkey. Americans took nuclear missiles that were in Turkey and they stopped them from being pointed at the Soviet Union. So both sides actually conceded something, okay? And we may not know exactly what America conceded there, but I think fundamentally it was basically that they couldn't beat China in trade war. They couldn't dictate terms to them. And in fact, the trade war was very ill-conceived in many ways, which I can get to. And so now these two curves of the US and China have met, but it's not going to continue at equality forever. It's the flippening is here, right? China's number one in cars. They're number one in steel. They're number one in ships. They're number one in almost every physical category. And they're number one militarily by a lot, depending on how you count, right? Hegseth, the defense secretary, has said that Chinese hypersonics can sink every U.S. aircraft carrier in the first 20 minutes. The Raytheon CEO, one of the primes, has said that the U.S. can't decouple from China. It's just too important. But it could decouple from Russia, which means you can't actually fight China. The Pentagon published a study showing that the JDAM and Tomahawk missile, the American armaments, were actually the supplier was Chinese. The Secretary of the Navy under the Biden administration, Carlos Del Toro, said that one Chinese shipyard creates more ships than the entire U.S. Navy combined, and on, right? So economic defeat, where treasuries are being sold for, and instead people are buying Chinese bonds, they're buying gold, they're buying digital gold. The U.S. military is weaker than the Chinese military. The American polity is internally divided. There's no such thing as America, only blue America, red America, and tech America. Just like there's no such thing as Korea. There's only North Korea, South Korea, and the Korean diaspora, right? Very much like that. So you have economic defeat, you have military defeat, you have political fragmentation, and they're all happening at the same time. And against that, basically, when you say this kind of thing, you get a reaction, which is something like, why do you hate America so much? That's what people will say, right? Which, of course, I don't. There's a lot of America's greatest empire of all time. I was born in the U.S. I think it's you could just spend an entire talk just going through all the amazing things that America contributed to the world, from obviously the science and technology, but the cultural things and political innovations, blah, blah, blah. You could spend the whole time going through that. And a lot of people do that. And I won't do that because just insert that whole thing here, right? What I will do is I'll make a defense not just of all those things, but actually of American empire. That's to say, America actually is not a country. It is the greatest empire of all time. That's why it has 750 military bases worldwide. That's why the center of the UN is in New York. That's why it has regulatory harmonization with every country abiding by American rules, like the FDA or the SEC writes rules for the US and then exports them to the whole world. That's why you have a McDonald's in every country and Hollywood on every screen. That's why, blue jeans are universal, and on and on and on and on, right? America was the greatest empire of all time. And so it wasn't a country. So basically the far left and the far right will both say something like, oh, American imperialism, that's what the left will say. Or the far right will say, we want a country, not an empire, a republic, not an empire, like Pat Buchanan. And I understand their points. The far left is saying America is harming the world. The far right is saying the world is harming American soldiers. We need to pull back and spend money on ourselves. But the center left and the center right built the greatest empire of all time. That was better than what the Soviets or Nazis would have done. And that was actually the defense. That was the reason they did it. The reason, until 1939, there's this great book called Tomorrow of the World, which basically documents the moment at which America decided to play for empire. Because up to that point, they'd said, hey, we're just going to build up in the US, let the British run empire. Empire is expensive. We don't want to do that. We understand what a burden it is, blah, blah, blah. We just want to build up our own country. And then, of course, they were doing the Philippines, they were doing other things like that, but they were not like primarily seeking to fight in Europe and all the way abroad and be an Asian power and so on and so forth. They were doing some of that, but they weren't really seeking to do it. But after the British Empire was on the ropes against the Nazis, after the fall of France, FDR's administration realized, actually, we have to play to be global number one, because otherwise the Nazis will win and they'll blockade us, or later the Soviets will win and they'll blockade us. So it's either us or the Nazis or the Soviets, so better be democratic capitalism. Because you don't become global number one in every single category by accident. That, a lot of people don't understand that. They're like, oh no, America's not an empire, it just happened by accident. Well, it was real and it was spectacular. Okay, however, it was invisible. That say huge amounts of effort was spent on, just like the Soviet Empire didn't call itself the Soviet Empire, it called itself communism and equality and so on and so forth. The American Empire didn't call itself the American Empire, it called itself democracy and capitalism and the rules-based order and so on and so forth. But the rule was America makes the rules. But America was so rich and so powerful that for a long time it could sort of afford to let everybody else operate on its system and sometimes take some L's. Like, for example, here's an interesting analogy. In the early 2010s or late 2000s, Google once had a situation where Google Chrome, like the team behind Google Chrome, had violated some SEO rules. And so Google imposed a search penalty on Google Chrome to show that it was, even though that was a huge project for Google, and it knocked it out of search results, to show that it was being impartial on its search engine. Okay? Because it was so successful that it could afford to take that hit and like very publicly abide by the same rules for everybody else and so on and so forth. Like, the Google Chrome guys had some marketer who had some dark backlinks, something like that, right? And America could afford to do that, where it was so dominant that it could afford to have itself bound by its own rules in some ways, right? To have powers that it held back. As the world converged with it, as China in particular, but really in general, the East and so on, as it rose, the US became more and more threatened and started to use those powers, right? Sanctions on Russia is one example, but so many other kinds of things. And now it's at the end of those powers. It threw the kitchen sink, everything from chips, et cetera, everything it had at China and lost, unfortunately. And yet there's still, like, because the whole system is set up to be invisible, to set up, like Biden, for example. Biden was senile, and only at the very last minute was it finally admitted and marked to market overnight, right? It was, the whole system was set up to obscure the reality until the impossible became inevitable, until the undeniable, like think about inflation, for example, it's transitory. Oh, who could have knew, right? Or COVID, like at the beginning of COVID, you were racist for saying that COVID existed, and then suddenly everybody had to be locked down like in a month or so after this, right? And then everybody had to go and do BLM riots, and then, it flipped back and forth multiple times. And so I think that the near-term future is a decentralized West and a centralized East, Chinese control and American anarchy. And hopefully we can fashion an international internet intermediate. And but I think those are going to be kind of the poles of the world. Let me pause there.
Okay, so you basically, if I'm to rephrase, you think that today China's position is much stronger than people believe. They have the edge in military, the economy, and even the future. And then America is slowly declining, and the future you think is going to be a clash between the internet, this concept of like a decentralized infrastructure versus centralized Chinese influence. Is that?
Yes. So, well, but when I say clash, it can be China versus internet. It could be China and the internet. It could be China or the internet. There's many different, like it could be a yin yang balance. It could be a choice, right? The thing is, China's almost like ideologically the opposite. The monkey, you know, the monkey's paw concept. Like, no, okay. You ask to, be taller, and the monkey makes you 1,000 feet tall, and so you're no longer like a human or what have you. You know, it's like a monkey's paw version of a wish. You know what I mean?
Oh, okay.
It's like,
I see.
It's like an extreme exaggeration of it that leads to like a bad version. Okay, so the China's like people who are against the neocons or the neolibs for kind of bombing everybody into democracy or what have you, right? China's a monkey's paw opposite of that. They genuinely don't care if a country is like Russia and it's Putinist and like quasi-Orthodox, or if it's like Iran and it's like, Shiite fundamentalist, or if it's a Venezuelan kleptocracy, or if it's a Singaporean meritocracy. They don't care. So long as that country doesn't interfere with China's internal affairs, using their phrase, they just don't care. They just want to trade with that country. They will sell arms or whatever to the legitimate government of that country, especially they'll sell surveillance stuff to that country. And what they do internally is their business, okay? That is the exact opposite of the neocons and neolibs. So China will sell surveillance equipment to Venezuela to prop up its genuinely evil regime, so long as it can pump oil from there and so on. It will prop up like the fundamentalists in Iran. It will prop up. Now, it will not, perhaps, go and invade other countries, but it will prop up the bad ones, right? And so that is also bad, because any surveillance tech that works in China for 1.4 billion Chinese is definitely going to work for like a 20 million person country, right? It's like stress tested on one of the most sophisticated, large scale, perhaps the most sophisticated, large-scale, technologically advanced population in the world. So if they can make that work there, then some small country of 20 million people, their surveillance tech will be completely airtight. All dissent is annihilated, and they run the CBDC or what have you locally, right? And again, China itself may have high living standards within China, but they really don't care about the rest of the world in this way, right? And so long as they're able to get the oil or the minerals or something out there, they'll just kind of sell that tech there. Now, the balance to that, if we're lucky, if China is Apple, it's like vertically integrated, right? The nation, the state, the network are vertically integrated. So the Han Chinese, that's the nation, the culture, the people. That's nation comes from the same root word as natality. So like common birth, common descent, genetics, like culture, et cetera, right? So the nation, when people say, I like the people, not the government, they say, I like the people, that's a nation, okay? Then there's the state, the Chinese party state, where the party and the state are one. It's a one-party state, okay? And the way that works is almost the party, there's 100 million people in the Communist Party of China. Most people don't know this, right? And actually, the CCP is similar to the CCP member is similar to the NYT subscriber. You know why?
Why?
Because the NYT subscriber was like a party member in America. That's to say, it's very similar. They get a digest of what the official words are, and they're supposed to repeat it in their own words. And you have to like pay, they think of themselves as like the upper middle class intelligentsia of the country. What the NYT subscriber was very similar to what the CCP member is in China, okay? People don't realize how, because with 100 million people in the Communist Party, it's a lot of people, but it's also only like 6% of the Chinese population, okay? They saw themselves as like the upper middle class of China. And if you had any political ambitions, you were a CCP member, and so on and so forth. So an NYT subscriber was like that. That was the paper of record. And so China's Communist Party is something like, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation, it's called like Qxi with a Q, which is like their New York Times, that all Communist Party members have to read and repeat and so on and so forth. And it's a really, ask AI about it. And depending on which AI, it'll tell you, okay, that's an interesting analogy, and I'll give you something, okay? But so in a deep sense, the Chinese Communist Party is the truth for China, and NYT until recently was the truth for America. Now it's at least the truth maybe for Blue America, maybe not even that, honestly. It's been so, just to digress, they optimized their budget and they optimized for money, but they lost status, they lost influence, and so on and so forth. This made this number go up and the other intangibles go down. Okay, coming back to the stack. So China's disintegrated Apple, nation, state, and network, right? Why? It's got the Great Firewall, it's got the Chinese apps, and they're just like insulated from the rest of the world in many dimensions. Obviously, they've got the Great Wall, they've got the Great Firewall, but they also got the Chinese language. So when crazy things are happening on the Anglo internet, and Charlie Kirk is assassinated or something like that, not only does the Chinese network just block those images from China if it wants to, it doesn't have to block it from any because they're just reading in Chinese. And so that serves itself as this giant, like, how often do you go and look at Chinese language content? Not that often, right? You have to go and seek it out, and then you hit and translate and so on and so forth. And a lot of it is behind apps, so it's not even on the open web, so it's not accessible, right? So they are really within their own world, and it's like this gigantic walled thing, but that's 1.4 billion people, so it's enough to carry on all functions of civilization just by itself, right? It's bigger than the US and Europe combined, right? US and Europe combined is only like 700 million people. China's 2x that. So they can do everything they can do plus. And vertically integrated under one government, highly unified population. For 200 years, they had, it wasn't just a century of humiliation, it's close to like 200 years. Communism was part of that century of humiliation. As Kaiser Kuo wrote, they finally figured out an alloy that works for them, some fusion of like Chinese traditionalism, communist, the Communist Party, techno-capitalism, blah, blah, blah. They fuse that together into an alloy that works for them. Fine. What's the alternative? The alternative to Apple is Android. So the other 6 billion people, the messy Anglophone open internet, right? In a sense, if you really zoom out, it's like the 20th century, where the 20th century was Eurasian communism versus Anglophilic or Anglospheric capitalism, right? Because it was, Russia and China, Eurasian communism, versus the UK and America and Anglospheric capitalism, right? So the 21st century is like that, where China versus the internet is, again, quote, Eurasian communism versus Anglospheric capitalism, except this time, I would argue the Eurasian communism is a stronger party, and it's on the right, and the Anglospheric capitalism will be the weaker party, and it'll be on the left. Why? Because China is nationalist, but they call it communist, right? They're not really, they're communist in name only in many ways. People will always argue this, right? But really, they just preserve the logo. The substance is 5,000 years of Chinese culture, right? It's the total opposite of Mao. Mao destroyed the four olds and declared war on the past. This is like, we're continuous with 5,000 years. That's not what communism is, right? It's like, it's similar to how Christianity, which tore down the Roman Empire, got turned into, as Nietzsche would say, from a slave religion to a master religion. It got turned into something that would buttress the Holy Roman Empire, right? So communism got turned around from a left religion that would destroy the empire into a right one that would support it. And so China is, and as a consequence, actually, it also has immunity against, for a short period of time or a medium period of time, against a lot of different leftist things. Like basically, if you've got, I talk about this in the Network State book, just to put some meat on the bones of that, because my references may not be clear on that, so let me explain. At the time of the Romans, Christianity was like the original communism. Why? It said like, sooner a camel go through the eye of a needle than a rich man get to heaven. It like renounced all the Roman old gods, it tore down the statues, and it was like this insane fundamentalist thing. And it took, all the Roman concepts and inverted them. The last, Romans were about honor and bravery and so on. And the Christians said the last shall be first and the first shall be last. It was basically inversion of every kind, right? And it said the weak are strong and the strong are bad and blah, blah, blah. Fine. So that tore down the Roman Empire eventually. In fact, not the very last, but towards the end of the Roman Empire, the emperor converted to Christianity, Constantine, and he reversed the direction of persecution. Now it wasn't Romans persecuting Christians, it was the empire persecuting those who had persecuted Christians. And then a few hundred years later, the Roman Empire collapsed from the contradictions, right? Because Christianity was just set up to tear it down, had taken it over. So this is sort of like BLM and so on, taking over the top of the US government, and it just kind of collapses eventually from the contradictions. From the ashes, because the whole thing didn't fall, the Eastern Roman Empire continued, we can talk about that later. But from the ashes in Western Europe, eventually thesis, antithesis formed a synthesis, and you got the Holy Roman Empire, which was, even if it was in a different place and a different people and so on and so forth, and wasn't exactly continuous with it, they at least honored those two things that they thought of as their past, and they fused them together into something that was capable of supporting civilization rather than destroying it, right? And they replicated the mimetic content of Christianity with the cross and so on, but they stripped away the pathogenic content that would destroy civilization, okay? This is similar to like an inactivated virus, so like an inactivated mind virus. And so that's what China's done to communism. They took the symbols of communism, just like Christianity has a cross, they took the symbols of communism, like the hammer and sickle, they preserved them, but they inactivated, after Deng Xiaoping, they inactivated the pathogenic, or many of the pathogenic pieces. So it's not destroying the four olds, it's not doing the Cultural Revolution, it's not doing the Great Leap Forward, they don't have mass starvation and mass murder in the streets and so on and so forth. Of course, they've got bad qualities to their regime, but the point is, that's China and the internet. Now, the internet is Anglospheric capitalism, but I could talk about that. I know I just did a whole soliloquy, so pause and go. Ask me questions.
I think I see what you're saying. It kind of reminds me actually of this thing I call commercial crypto, which is to say like the cypherpunk and the commercial, and the cypherpunk has kind of been stripped out, but it's only, the market has washed away ideology and only left intact what's useful for these enterprises to function. But okay, so I do want to get, with the little time that we have left, into crypto and like
Sure.
how you see it as a tool. Like, do you see it as the building blocks of this Android operating system, or do you see it as maybe the tool that people that are kind of caught in the middle between, let's say, the West and the East would flee to, something that China would use? Like, what is your mental model of crypto? How does Bitcoin, Zcash, et cetera, come into it?
So I'll try now to be concise. Crypto is the backup of American values, but it's also the next version of it. Like, you go from Britain to America to the internet, you go from common law to constitution to smart contract. It's like the version 3.0. Except a Turk, an Indian, Japanese, a Brazilian, we're all equal on the internet. We have exactly the same terms on a smart contract. You might be a second-class citizen in America on an H-1B, but you're a first-class citizen on the internet with TCP/IP, to paraphrase our mutual friend Akshay, right? And so you don't need the H-1B visa if you have the TCP/IP visa. So just that alone gives rule of code, global rule of code, that replaces rule of law. At least half, it gives the digital part. So the question is, can you get the physical part? Can we print out the cloud onto the land? Just like we've got a Google Doc, we can print that out. Just like you've got an Amazon shopping cart, you print that out to your front door. Or you've got an Uber, and you print out the car, in a sense, to your front door, right? Can we take a social network, a cloud community, and can we print that out in the physical world, which we're doing at Network School, which you're doing with the Salon economic zones in Kazakhstan, which Vitalik and the Ethereum community are doing with Zuzulu, which is like the Ethereum network state, which Coinbase is doing with Basecamp, Tesla is doing with its Tesla diners, SpaceX is doing it with Starbase, right? We're printing out the cloud onto the land. And that is how, like, just like Christianity was what survived after Rome, and eventually it led to a rebooted civilization, the internet survives after the West hits sovereign debt crisis and frankly collapses, and we can reboot civilization like the mammals arising after the meteor hits the dinosaurs. And that's the point of crypto. Is, crypto anarchy is not full anarchy, fortunately, because at least there's some rule of law in the cloud. There's some property rights, there's some identity, and so on. Even if the physical world is totally anarchic, the digital world at least has some order. And even in places where, like, you literally have civil war, you still somehow have cell phone videos, right? Because the internet was built to resist a nuclear attack, right? And people will argue about that. They'll say, oh, it wasn't really. there's enough to show that ARPA, it was conscious of this, that ARPANET was designed in part to be decentralized to resist nuclear attack. That's why people say the internet perceives censorship as damage and routes around it, right? The whole point with packet switching is to be very robust, find many different paths to that end goal, right? And so that is why, A, the West falls, B, the internet rises, C, we print out the internet.
And do you think we're doing a sufficient job of that today? And like, where I'm going to go with this? I'm going to try to talk my own book here.
Privacy.
Which is to say, like, exactly.
So I think, I don't think most people in crypto, how like around, I'm not a Christian and you're not, but how, I don't think you are, around Christmas time, people will say, remember the reason for the season, right? Like, meaning, no, you never heard that?
No.
It's like the reason for the season is Jesus, the reason for the season, right? And now you could take a very cynical comparative studies view on this and you could say, well, look, Santa Claus and snow is obviously like some Germanic, European pagan thing. And that's gotten fused with Jesus Christ and Bethlehem and the manger, which is like this desert scene. And so clearly those things have nothing to do with each other, but they've been put together into Christmas because it's like a fusion of the pagan and the Christian, right? Hence like the Holy Roman Empire, right? Okay, fine. You could take that. But you could also just take it at face value and you could say, okay, what they're saying is Christmas isn't just about the commercial part, it's also about the religious part. That's the reason we're celebrating for baby Jesus and so on and so forth. Okay. So extending that here, crypto isn't just about the commercial part, it's about the ideological part. It's about the fact that the banks have failed. It's about the fact the political system has failed. It's about the fact that we need an exit. It's about the fact that we need self-sovereignty. And the missing part of that is privacy. And basically, the way I look at it is the two major innovations on Bitcoin were programmability in the form of Ethereum and privacy in the form of Zcash. And the entire programmability story went through Ethereum and then now Solana and scaling and NFTs and smart contracts and smart contract verification and all kinds of hacks, exchange hacks, stable coins, now laws and stuff for exchanges.
Markets.
Go ahead.
Yeah, like internet capital markets. Et cetera,
That's right. DEXs, exactly. So that whole thread, basically, I don't want to say it's at its end, but like we now have scalable on-chain smart contracts that can support large numbers of users, large numbers of transactions with finality. There's multiple good chains. It works. It runs 24/7. It's free. A lot of the original vision was realized, and it works in developing countries. We've banked the unbanked. This stuff is no longer theory. It's actually there, right? Mm-hmm. It's working on phones. In Bolivia, they quote prices in Tether, right? In Nigeria, they save in Bitcoin. Like the percentages are real because the smartphones are everywhere. The smartphone, your phone is your bank account, right? Because you could just set up a crypto address. Okay, so that whole storyline of programmability, I'm not saying it's done, but it is mature in a way that even 3 years ago, I would not say scaling was solved. Obviously, there's still L2s, there's still going to be problems to solve, but let's say you can do a lot on chain today, much more than you could, right? Okay. Mm-hmm. Another way of putting that is a huge increase in block space. Like, in the early web, bandwidth was a scarce resource, which is why Amazon didn't, it was just a mail order catalog. Google was just put in text and return text, 10 blue links. As bandwidth increased, you could start to have social networks with pictures. Then eventually you could have video sites. Then you could eventually have like mobile video. So bandwidth was a constraint where you actually had to build giant companies that would fund more bandwidth, that would allow you to do new companies that would fund more bandwidth and so on and so forth, right? And it was non-trivial to do things in a bandwidth constrained environment. For the last 10, 15 years, we've been doing stuff in a block space constrained environment. Mm-hmm. And now that's starting to lift and new applications are becoming possible, like Farcaster, for example. Okay. So programmability is one giant storyline. And now the next, let's say 8 years, if the first 8 years-ish of crypto were proving that Bitcoin would work, right? And then the next 8 years were proving that programmability would work, right? Including scalability and so on. Now the next 8 years, so like first 8, 2009, 2017, then Ethereum rose in 2017, 2017, 2025, programmability. Now 2025 to 2030 something, privacy. which is say taking everything we just did and encrypting it using ZK. So ZKYC, right? ZK dexes, ZK smart contracts, minimum necessary information on everything, right? And this may require all kinds of modifications to the base level. It may require new L1s. It may require entirely new companies. It probably will, right? And it's highly technical. I would say, ZK is as technical in its own way as AI, right? Like you can get incredibly deep. I mean, it's a different part of math, obviously. It's cryptography, it's discrete mathematics as opposed to continuous math, of AI for the most part. But it's definitely something that can absorb a lot of high IQ people. And it's important because if you nail ZK, then you can replace the entire, Coinbase gave a 40-page PDF on this, where basically they showed that KYC could be replaced by ZKYC, right?
Yes.
So this is the next storyline, I think, a big part of it. It's not the only part. I think crypto communities are a big part. I think crypto identity is a big part, like ENS and SNS. Crypto community being network state startup societies. But privacy is a very, very big part. Let me pause there, and we have to wrap because I've got to jump in a minute or two. Any closing words?
No closing words. I will ask a quick flash question. Okay,
Sure.
just for the benefit of me. Okay, so you, Akshay, and Naval are extremely good at random wordsmithing and wordplay, and it's one of my most admired traits of you guys. How do you do it? What do you practice?
I don't practice. It's like, there's some people who are, as they're walking around, they're thinking about what they're going to do in their garage with woodworking or something. They've got like a shape in their head and they want to kind of make that. Or there's like an artist, they've got a sketch in their head, right? Mm-hmm. For me, I just will constantly be making little notes about little concepts. And then I'll kind of turn them around and just like you'll take a figurine and some people will just kind of file it. And I will just kind of file until I get exactly the right configuration and I put it out there, right? But I would not call it something, I'm not sure I could teach it or something like that. Just like something I like to do, So anyway.
Cool. All right. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, sir.